Okay, welcome to the 8th Frith Prize lecture. I'm Celia Hayes, currently president of the Experimental Psychology Society, so it's my pleasure to introduce this year's winner of the Frith Prize, Dr. Rose Cooper. Now, the Frith Prize was established in 2011 with a generous gift from Uta and Chris Frith to recognize experimental psychologists at the start of their career who have produced an exceptional body of work in their PhD thesis. Now, Rose completed her first degree in psychology in Nottingham and then an MSc at UCL, and then her PhD in Cambridge under the supervision of John Simons, and she's currently a postdoc in the Memory Modulation Lab at Boston College in Boston, Massachusetts. Rose's thesis, which is of course that for which she gets the Frith Prize, was on the neurocognitive basis of recollection in autism. And it advanced our understanding of episodic memory in this atypical group using eye tracking and fMRI, and in a tremendously subtle way, behavioral techniques. And in that work, although of course it was collaborative, she very definitely took the intellectual lead, and it was published in 6 articles in highly respected journals. Now, one of the many things that impressed me in the nomination for Rose was that she got warm praise and intellectual respect from her external examiner, Sebastian Gaig, who actually holds a contrasting position to the one that Rose advanced in her thesis. So he's inclined to think that the primary problem that autistic people have with episodic memory is at encoding, whereas I understand it, Rose is going to argue that it's at retrieval. So I think that's very much a credit to them both that Sebastian Gaig would, across that disagreement, be willing to register that respect, and that Rose would command it so early in her career. So it's with pleasure and admiration that I ask you to join me in welcoming Rose to give the Frith Lecture.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and thank you to EPS for awarding me this prize this year, and of course to both Uta and Chris Frith for setting up this award a few years ago now. And before I jump into the talk, I also want to thank the University of Cambridge, and also in particular my supervisor at the time, John Simons, for all of the support and guidance they gave me really throughout all of this work that I'll present to you today. So I just want to actually start with an example of one of my memories. So this is not a particularly emotional experience of mine. It's not something that I recollect very vividly, but it's simply just a past event in my life that I think I can remember reasonably well. This is a photo I took actually last November when I was in San Diego for Society for Neuroscience. And it's a specific time and place associated with several details uniquely bound to that moment. So these might be sights, sounds, the feeling of how warm it was, the route I walked around this park, and actually also what I was wearing that day, because I'd given a presentation earlier in that day. And the fact that I can very easily re-experience all of these details in my mind right now when they're completely physically dissociated from my current environment is actually very incredible, not least because my brain apparently is allowing me to just travel back in time, but because this is only one of thousands of possible events that I could actually bring to mind in this given moment. So Endel Tolving defined this as episodic memory, so our ability to reflect upon a very specific, in terms of a spatial and temporal context, event in our lives accompanied by a sense of autonoetic awareness, which is basically placing the self back into the personal past and being able to recollect that experience from a first-person perspective. And episodic memory is extremely important for a number of things in human social cognition and behavior, including how we learn from our mistakes, how we actually develop our self-identity and build our self-awareness, and also how we form and maintain social relationships. So it's actually very easy to see how disruptive this could be to the way we act if a difficulty was present with this ability in any way. So my doctoral research really focused on exactly how and why this vastly complex neurocognitive process might operate differently in autistic adults. So I'll just start by telling you a bit about what we know about episodic memory in the neurotypical population, and also what existing research has taught us about this in ASD. And then I'll go through 3 studies that I ran to look at this using different methods. So the first being a behavioral study where we contrasted memory processes and representations. The second, an eye tracking study where we used eye movements to distinguish between different stages of memory, so encoding and retrieval. And then finally, an fMRI study where we tried to tease apart different aspects of memory or recollective experience. So autism spectrum disorder, that I'll refer to as ASD throughout this talk, reflects a different neurocognitive developmental trajectory. So what this means is that autistic children and adults, as you've already heard from some of the talks today, can show difficulties with social emotional processing, social communication, and building and forming social relationships. But they can also exhibit things like restricted behaviors and fixated interests and routines, and also often show sensory hypersensitivity to the external world. So it becomes pretty obvious that memory actually doesn't come up on any list of diagnostic criteria for autism, so why study it? Well, it could obviously have extremely important knock-on effects for these behavioral characteristics that we most associate with autism. So the first thing to make very clear when approaching this topic is that ASD is by no means any form of amnesic disorder. So you do not see these global memory deficits. And really what research has taught us over the last 30 or 40 years is that ASD is associated with a pattern of similarities or strengths and then difficulties relative to the neurotypical population. So similarities or sometimes strengths can include things like procedural memory, so learning how to perform tasks, implicit memory, including unconscious influences on behavior, semantic memory, so knowledge for facts, such as knowing that the capital of France is Paris. And then these last 3 terms have really been used to refer to the same type of memory, which is a good ability to recognize previously encountered information, such as objects that we've seen in our environment before. However, pretty consistently, we see that both autistic children and adults show a difficulty in recalling and reliving specific past events in their lives, so retrieving and recollecting very specific episodic information. So start to put this into context, it's really important to consider what we know about the way in which episodic memory works in the neurotypical population. So a vast body of research, I probably don't need to tell many of you this, has implicated the hippocampus as being a critical structure for retrieving specific past events. And this has largely come from lesion evidence. So for example, patient HM, who had a bilateral medial temporal lobe lesion and was unable to form new memory subsequently. But of course, since this lesion evidence, a vast amount of neuroimaging work has supported the role of the hippocampus in memory, so that the hippocampus shows elevated activity during encoding for events that are successfully remembered subsequently. And then also during memory retrieval, you see elevated hippocampal activity when you're retrieving past events compared to when you forget those events or you're performing other types of tasks. But even though the hippocampus is extremely important for episodic memory, what functional neuroimaging work has done has revealed actually a much broader network of cortical brain regions that co-activate with the hippocampus when we're remembering past events. And by some, this has been termed to be now the core recollection network. So if you think about it, it's perhaps unsurprising that such a large network of brain regions show some sensitivity to episodic memory, given the complexity of the processes involved and the different types of details you need to integrate to form a coherent episodic memory experience. But on the flip side of that, it makes it very difficult to start to pinpoint the nature of any episodic memory difficulty that we see. So a number of theories within the neurotypical literature have really tried to tease apart what these different brain regions might be contributing to episodic memory. And while really discussing the differences of those theories is far beyond today's talk, I just wanted to extract some commonalities that we think different brain regions are contributing to memory. So the hippocampus, we think, is particularly important for relational binding, and this is binding together constituent aspects of experience with their spatial and temporal context in order to form that very specific, unique event representation. Medial prefrontal cortex, on the other hand, is very important for self-related processing, so self-projection and putting the self back into the personal past, and also extracting commonalities across experiences to form schemas, for example. Lateral prefrontal cortex, rather, is thought to engage a more controlled process, so really guiding how we go about learning information and then how effectively we're able to search for and reconstruct those details at retrieval. And then finally, lateral posterior parietal cortex has been shown to actually represent very event-specific details during conscious recollection itself. So with these neurocognitive episodic memory functions in mind that we've learned about from the neurotypical population, what has existing research really taught us about memory in ASD? Well, the vast majority of research comes from behavioral paradigms, and while there are some inconsistencies in the literature, there are 3 lines of evidence that I think have really showed the most reliable patterns across both autistic children and adults. So first, using autobiographical reports, studies have often revealed that autistic children and adults report fewer event-specific details when asked about their personal past. So for example, if asked to report an episodic memory, an autistic participant might say something like, "We went on holiday to France," so a very general factual statement about an event that happened to them. In contrast, a neurotypical participant might say something like, "I remember walking into school on my first day, I felt nervous but excited," so really reliving a specific moment in their past. But of course, asking participants to verbally report their memories has a number of problems associated with it, particularly when looking at populations such as ASD. So this means that other types of paradigms have really tried to exert a lot more control over episodic memories by creating these artificial episodic memories in the lab. So this can involve showing participants a series of items, it might be words or it might be objects, and then manipulating the context or source in which they're studied. So it could be manipulating the mental context, so asking participants to do different things with those items, or it could be changing the visual context, so manipulating the location of these items, for example. And in these studies, what you fairly consistently see is that autistic participants are just as good at neurotypical controls at recognizing the items that they have studied before, but they are less able to tell you about the context in which they studied those items, the experimental context in which they studied them. Again, supporting this difficulty recollecting these event-specific details. And finally, another strand of evidence has used subjective reports to assess episodic memory. So in these types of experiments, participants might study a series of events like this, and then in a memory test, they would be represented with part of that event and would be asked to judge subjectively if they can recollect any of the contextual details that went along with that item during encoding. So responses in this type of task could be based on remembering or recollecting the original experience. So participants would say that they feel that they are able to subjectively recollect some details about the original encoding event. Or responses could be based on knowing or familiarity. So they'll tell you that they recognize the item that you're showing them, but they're unable to recollect any additional contextual details. And when you look at these types of responses, these studies very consistently show that autistic subjects make fewer of these remember responses. So they're less likely to say that they subjectively recollect the original experience. So existing behavioral research in ASD based on these studies has really pointed to a difficulty with 2 things. So first, that they find it difficult to remember these relational or contextual aspects of past events. And secondly, that they subjectively report reduced instances of recollection. So they feel like they are less able to explicitly recollect past events in their lives. But the first thing I really realized when approaching this topic at the beginning of my PhD is that these 2 things are really not necessarily one and the same, even though they have largely been treated as such in both the neurotypical literature and in autism. And this is because episodic memory is multifaceted and requires both the coordination of memory representations, which is the kinds of details that you're able to remember or encode, and then also memory processes that control how we manipulate and search for that information. So specifically, one assumption has often been that a hippocampal relational binding process, so binding together details with their context, is synonymous with or actually directly causes this subjective experience of recollecting episodic memories. However, as I mentioned before, episodic memory is actually associated with activity in a large network of cortical brain regions. And a lot of theories now really suggest that this additional experience of episodic memory is dependent upon interactions between the hippocampus and this cortical network, and not just the hippocampus alone. Therefore, what I believe is that basic relational binding is likely very vital for episodic memory, but is unlikely to be sufficient to give rise to our subjective experience of recollection. So there are quite a few areas of research that I think really support this, but I'm just going to highlight two studies from the neurotypical literature that come at this from very different ways. So the first study is one by Debbie Hanula and Charan Ranganath, and this is a really elegant paradigm where they just ask participants to learn the association between these faces and scenes. And then in a memory test, while monitoring participants' eye movements, they asked them to decide which face had been paired with which scene at encoding. And what they found was that the hippocampus actually tracked disproportionate viewing of the correct face during retrieval, even in instances where the explicit memory decision was incorrect. So the hippocampus was really tracking implicit identification of the correct face, so implicit relational binding. However, they further found that it was lateral prefrontal cortex to hippocampal connectivity or communication that really predicted explicit correct retrieval of the face, so explicit recollection. And secondly, taking a different approach, this study by Kim and Yasser demonstrated that successful recollection need not always be based on memory for relational or contextual details, and actually in some instances that is not helpful at all. And that's largely dependent on the type of memory task you use. So for example, in this type of paradigm, participants would study a series of objects, and then in the memory test, they would see some of these objects again, but some of the ones that they would see would be very perceptually similar, but fundamentally different to ones that they had seen before. So if you look at the pineapple, you can see that it's obviously extremely similar to the one that they studied, but fundamentally different. And in this type of task, being able to recollect any contextual details about when you studied this pineapple to start with is really not going to help you at all make this memory decision. What you need to do is to recollect very item-specific details that would help you to reject this similar but different item as new in the memory test. So in this first behavioral study that I'll tell you about, we aim to directly contrast the types of memory representations, so item-specific or contextual relational details, with the type of memory process that we use to retrieve that information. So based on the existing literature that I've discussed, we expected that recognizing item details based on a sense of familiarity would be very similar between our two groups, but our autistic participants would show a reduced ability to recollect these relational or contextual details of past experiences. But what we would see along the diagonal, we really had no idea at this point. So to get at this question, we adapted a paradigm that had been used by Debbie Hanula previously to test the nature of episodic memory differences both in hippocampal amnesia and also in schizophrenia. So our autistic and neurotypical control subjects were just asked to study a series of these computer-generated scenes, and each one just contained different types of objects. And then in the memory test, we represented them with these scenes, but in 3 different conditions. So the first condition, we would show them a scene that was exactly the same as one that they had studied. Or the scene would be identical, apart from one of the items within the scene was changed perceptually. So crucially, the item is in the same location and is the same semantically, but its perceptual features are now slightly different. or one of the scenes that we showed them could again be identical apart from one of the objects has moved from one location in the scene to another, so changing the relationship between that item and its spatial context. And participants had to identify which of these three conditions they felt the scene belonged to. And then regardless of their response, we asked them to judge subjectively if their decision was based on remembering or recollecting how the scene had appeared originally, or based on a sense of knowing or familiarity that the scene was either the same or different, but being unable to recollect exactly why. And just for reference, this latter condition here, where we're manipulating the item-context relationship, is one that shows a disproportionate deficit in hippocampal amnesia. So if our autistic participants also have a more pronounced difficulty in encoding relational representations, then what we would expect is a similar but obviously less severe pattern, in that they would be disproportionately reduced in identifying these spatial changes within the scenes, but not these very item-specific details that we believe, based on previous studies, that they should be fine to detect. However, if episodic memory is actually characterized by a difficulty engaging in recollective retrieval and subjectively reliving an event and placing the self back at that point, we should see reduced instances of this process that should have knock-on effects for identifying both item and spatial changes in these scenes. And what we found was exactly the latter. So our ASD group made fewer of these subjective recollection-based responses that had implications for their ability to detect both item and spatial changes within these scenes. And since we ran this behavioral study, there's actually been some interesting supporting evidence from Dermot Bowler's lab. And in their behavioral paradigms, they first found, for example, that if you match the representational complexity for item and item location associations, that you also see an impairment in memory for both types of details in ASD. And then they also found, when looking at the relationship or memory for item location relationships, they found that ASD participants were just as good at controls at identifying these locations implicitly, but were only impaired when they were asked to explicitly identify where the object had appeared in the scene. So this behavioral study to us really highlighted a very important distinction in episodic memory research, not just for ASD studies, but also for the neurotypical literature, and that's that representations reflect what we encode or remember, so the types of details that go into our memories, whereas processes reflect how we encode or remember, so how we manipulate that information. And in our autistic adults, we found that they were disproportionately impaired in explicit recollection of both relational and item-specific details of past events. So what we wanted to do next was actually try to distinguish between different stages of memory, so memory, encoding, and retrieval. And this was largely because, based on the previous results that I've described, we really have no way of knowing at what stage these memory differences are occurring. So is it occurring when, for example, participants are encoding these details, and perhaps our autistic subjects are less likely to engage in effective encoding strategies, and they might be attending to different parts of our stimuli, for example, that would have knock-on effects for subsequent memory. Alternatively, it could be that differences are happening at the retrieval stage, so difficulties in searching for information that we've encoded and actually reconstructing those details later on. So distinguishing between encoding and retrieval might sound like it could be a straightforward problem to address. However, distinguishing between these two stages of memory is actually very difficult, and this is because the way we would naturally try to test if information has been encoded is to ask participants to retrieve that information later on, so that becomes very circular. One thing we can do to try to distinguish between encoding and retrieval is to look at eye movements. And I just want to highlight two studies in the neurotypical population that have used eye movements to look at different types of encoding and retrieval processes. So this first study here asked their participants to engage in a continuous recognition task. And for this type of task, what participants do is see a series of objects, and on each trial, they simply have to tell you if the object is old or new. So the object is new if it's the first time they've seen it in the list, and it is old if it's the second time they've seen it in the list. But crucially, in this paradigm, some of the objects were actually extremely perceptually similar to one of the objects that they would have seen before. So in order to correctly reject that similar object as new, they would need to have a very specific memory for the details of the other object they saw on its first presentation. And what these authors found is that falsely identifying these similar but different objects as new was associated with reduced fixations to that item on its first presentation. So impoverished encoding was leading to false recognition of these items. And now, during retrieval, this study really looked at what I'll call fixation reinstatement. So this is the overlap in the pattern of fixations made to a stimulus during encoding, and then when represented with that stimulus or a similar stimulus later on. And what you find is that participants tend to recreate the pattern of eye movements they make when successfully retrieving something compared to when they've forgotten it. And so this actually would prove to be a very useful window into how episodic memories are re-experienced during the retrieval stage specifically. So adapting these type of paradigms, in this next study, we asked our participants to study a series of scenes while we monitored their eye movements. And these scenes were encoded in one of two conditions. They were either encoded incidentally, so when participants were studying them, they were not aware that there was going to be a memory test. Or they were encoded intentionally, where we asked them to try to use any encoding strategy that they thought would help them to best remember the very specific details of these scenes later on. And then during retrieval, we represented our participants with some of these scenes. Some of them were identical to ones that they had seen before, but some of them were very perceptually similar, but fundamentally different to scenes that they had studied. So if you look at the scene in the bottom right, that was the one that they originally studied, and that was the one that they would be presented with at test. So they're very similar, but fundamentally different in some way. So participants were asked to identify if each scene was old or new, and then also subjectively report if their decision was based on recollecting how the scene had looked when they studied it originally, or based on a sense of familiarity or unfamiliarity with the scene, but not being able to recollect how it had looked before. So just looking at the behavioral results to start with, what we found was largely a replication of our previous findings in that our autistic subjects made fewer of these subjective recollection responses. So they were less able to remember, based on episodic memory, the appearance of these scenes originally. And this had knock-on effects for their behavioral performance in both the incidental and intentional encoding conditions. But something that I found particularly interesting was that our ASD subjects were just as good as our control subjects at generating effective encoding strategies that would improve their performance from the incidental to the intentional encoding conditions. So they were able to do something at encoding that was just as effectively boost their performance later on. So now turning to eye movements, what we found was that during encoding, our two groups actually fixated and made fixation patterns to these scenes in a very similar way. So this was in terms of both the number of fixations being made, so the number of times you're looking at a distinct feature, and also the pattern of these fixations, so the types of features that people tended to be looking at within these scenes. I should note, however, that all of our stimuli, for multiple reasons, are non-socials. They never include people. And also we found, in parallel to the improvement in memory, both groups were increasing the fixations they made to these scenes between the incidental and intentional encoding conditions. So what this suggests is that for both groups, an increase in the number of fixations they were making to these scene images was serving to accumulate evidence that would therefore improve subsequent memory overall. However, unlike in the control group, where we found that falsely recognizing similar images as old was associated with impoverished encoding, so false alarms were associated with reduced number of fixations during encoding compared to subsequently correct memory decisions, this relationship simply did not exist in our ASD group. So there's a dissociation between what is happening in encoding, as at least as indexed by eye movements, and how successfully they're able to remember these scenes later on. And one possibility you could argue is that perhaps there are subtle differences in the noise or quality of the eye movement data in our ASD group that means that these trial-specific measures are just not sensitive to memory performance. However, when you look at retrieval, both groups showed an increased number of fixations when they were making an incorrect memory judgment that I would argue suggests some evidence for implicit memory in both of our groups. Moreover, we found that our control group reinstated their fixation patterns during successful episodic recollection. So this relates to that previous study I talked about and was as we predicted, that during episodic retrieval, our example control participant that you can see on the right was looking at very similar features within the scene when they were retrieving it compared to when they encoded it originally. However, in our example ASD subject, you can see that the features that they're fixating on during encoding are actually quite different from the ones that they tend to fixate on during retrieval. And this is even in a situation where they are correct and they are reporting subjective recollection. So to us, what this suggests is that even during successful situations of episodic memory retrieval, these memories might be being re-experienced in a qualitatively different way in autistic subjects compared to in neurotypical controls. So to summarize what we found so far, so eye movements at encoding we actually found were very similar between our two groups, and both groups were able to change their eye movements and behavioral performance with engaging in elaborative or strategic encoding tasks. And we found that there was a dissociation between what was happening at encoding and trial-specific retrieval success in our ASD group, which was also associated with reduced reinstatement of eye movements, so possibly indicative of a different recollective experience in our autistic subjects compared to in our neurotypical controls. So all of the prior research I've mentioned so far, so other studies, including our own, have really measured episodic memory and recollection in a very coarse, binary way. So quantifying memory as being correct or incorrect on any given trial based on the ability of participants to retrieve fairly precise episodic information. But this is not how memory works at all. Recollection is not this all or none process. And what I mean by that is that our brain doesn't work like a video recorder. When we remember, we don't get played back to us an experience in exactly the same way that we encountered it to start with. If the brain worked like this, it would be very inefficient. Really what happens when we're engaging in episodic retrieval is that we are reconstructing a previous experience. And a byproduct of this is that our memories can be extremely variable, both in terms of the content of our memories and the types of details that we're able to remember, as well as the precision of individual features. So with this in mind, what would my cognitive processes actually be if someone were to ask me to remember what I did in San Diego? Well, a number of theories about how memories are reconstructed, at least in the neurotypical population, really focus on the importance of first establishing a global spatial context. So I might start by remembering this overall location, so when I went to the park, for example. And once we have this global spatial context in mind, this really acts as a scaffold to help us start to rebuild the types of details that we did or might have seen in that location. So once I have this framework, I might be able to remember that, oh, there was a tower, there was a fountain, and there were some tables and chairs near me. But of course, I will also forget many of the features that had actually been present. So I might have no memory at all for this building in the background or people walking past, for example. So once I have those details, the kind of final piece of the puzzle is to put them back together in a precise way as possible. So this involves binding them together into their original configuration and also retrieving the appearance of each detail as precisely as possible. But when I do this, I will do so in a way that means that my memory is inevitably not going to be perfectly precise. So I might remember this tower as being more to the right than it actually was, and I might misremember that this umbrella was purple instead of its original blue color. So what I end up with is actually a mental reconstruction and representation of an episodic memory that is far from perfect, but still contains very complex, multidimensional information. And I should also add, of course, that I could add details into this I didn't experience at all, but I won't talk about that type of memory distortion today. So in a study with a postdoc in the lab at the time, Frank Richter, we were really interested in if these two components of episodic memory and recollection, so remembering features within our experience, but also retrieving the exact precision of those details, were dissociable on a behavioral and neural level. And what we found here is that the hippocampus was very important for retrieving features of past events, involved in constructing and binding episodic information. Whereas a region in posterior parietal cortex, the angular gyrus, activity here scaled with the specific precision with which we could remember individual episodic features. So activity would increase from a very gist-like representation of a detail through to a very highly precise memory. So we wanted to know what this type of paradigm could tell us really about the specific nature of episodic memory deficits in autism spectrum disorder. So in this experiment, we had our participants learn a series of displays while in an MRI scanner. And these displays consisted of a background scene with 3 objects overlaid. And we asked participants to learn all of this information as best as they could. Crucially, though, we manipulated each of the objects continuously in terms of 3 possible features. So focusing on this umbrella here, each object could be any location on the screen, around a 360-degree circle, any orientation, and also any color sampled from a continuous color spectrum. So we had a really fine-grained way of manipulating the appearance of these objects. And then in a subsequent memory test, we cued our participants with one of the background scenes, and we asked them to try to remember the appearance of all of the objects that had been associated with that background. But crucially, what we wanted to do was to ask participants to actually reconstruct the appearance of the objects that they had studied. So they would be shown an object in a random combination of features, and we would ask them to move around a circle to place the object back in its original location, turn the object, and also cycle through this color spectrum to change the appearance of the object's color, with the aim of making it look as close to how they remember seeing it originally as possible. So using these types of memory measures, what we end up with is a very fine-grained measure of memory performance. So not a binary correct or incorrect, but actually the error or distance between the original value of any given feature and the response that that participant made during the memory test. So I've simulated a distribution of what these response errors might look like for any given participant who could do the task reasonably well. So we would expect response errors to be clustered around the correct value, which would be an error of 0, but with some variability in how precise people are able to remember these objects. We will also see some uniformly distributed responses which would reflect random guessing. So if a participant can't remember anything, you would expect their responses to be randomly distributed across the response space. And what we do with these response errors is fit a mixture model to them containing a circular Gaussian distribution as well as a uniform component to estimate 2 properties of episodic memory. So the first is retrieval success, which is simply defined as the probability that participants are not guessing. So what is the proportion of trials that appear to be clustered around the correct value in some way versus trials that appear to be randomly distributed across the response space? And then secondly, what we can do is estimate retrieval precision. So this reflects for trials that you have remembered something, on average, how precise is your memory? So a participant who is very precise on average would have a very narrow error distribution, and a participant who is actually quite GIST-like a lot of the time would have a very wide error distribution. So the first thing we wanted to do was to compare these errors between our two groups behaviorally. So the first thing that's quite obvious from these two plots is that both groups could do this task reasonably well. So in both cases, you see that responses are clustered around the correct value, so an error of 0, but with obviously some degree of variation in how precise they were. But by fitting our mixture model to the data, we're able to test if there are any differences between our two groups, and if so, if they map onto different components of episodic memory. And when we do this, what we find is that our ASD group showed a reduction in retrieval success, so they were more likely to guess on any given trial and not remember anything about an object's feature. But when they did remember, their memory was actually just as precise as in our control group. So if they did remember a feature, they were getting it just as close to the correct value as our neurotypical control participants. So what this could suggest is that episodic memory differences in autistic participants may be more associated with a difficulty reconstructing the same number of details rather than a difficulty representing or encoding the specific precision of that information to start with. So we next turn to our neuroimaging analyses, and the first thing we wanted to do was to compare brain activity between our two populations during memory encoding and memory retrieval. So here we actually found predominantly that brain activity between our two groups during encoding overall and also associated with retrieval success and precision was largely similar. So both groups appear to be doing very similar things when encoding these scenes and then when trying to retrieve them later on. However, one interesting difference is that only brain activity of our control group predicted the likelihood of them actually having a more detailed memory later on. So in our neurotypical control subjects, we found activity in these ventral visual areas, as well as in left lateral prefrontal cortex, predicted subsequent memory detail, and those are very common regions to find in relation to subsequent memory. However, in our ASD group, despite the fact that overall their pattern of encoding activity was the same, the degree to which that activity actually predicted subsequent memory was really broken down. That relationship didn't seem to really be there. And you might notice that this parallels the findings that we had from the eye tracking study, where we saw a very similar thing with eye movements. So the next thing we wanted to do was, rather than look at brain activity between our two groups, based on focus of neuroimaging research within ASD more generally, we wanted to look at functional connectivity. So this is the degree to which brain activity of brain regions are in or out of sync with other areas of the brain during memory encoding and retrieval. So to do this type of analysis, we take the time series of activity of two regions. So here we focused on angular gyrus and hippocampus based on their roles that we've demonstrated in retrieval precision and retrieval success, and correlated the activity of these regions with the activity time series of every other voxel in the brain. So we're getting an index for encoding and retrieval of how in or out of sync these brain regions are with other areas of the brain. And what we find from this analysis was that actually during encoding, both the angular gyrus and hippocampus were just as in or out of sync in our ASD participants as in our neurotypical control participants. But when we looked during retrieval, we found a selective reduction in hippocampal connectivity in our ASD group compared to our neurotypical control group. So when trying to reconstruct these experiences during retrieval, the hippocampus is more out of sync with cortical areas in ASD subjects compared to in controls. And we can draw a tentative parallel here between these findings and the behavioral difference we found, where our ASD subjects showed a reduction in retrieval success that we believe maps onto hippocampal functioning, but no difference in retrieval precision, which we believe is related to angular gyrus. And we can actually see this pattern much more clearly when we zoom out and look at this whole brain level. So brighter colors here reflect a stronger correlation between the activity of the seed region on the left and any given voxel. And in angular gyrus, you can see that this region is really connecting to very similar regions of the brain in both of our groups during memory retrieval itself. However, when you look at the hippocampus, you see this really striking reduction in the degree to which the hippocampus is communicating with other areas of the brain during memory retrieval in our autistic participants. And when statistically comparing our two groups, we find that our neurotypical control subjects show greater communication between the hippocampus and these lateral prefrontal regions, as well as ventral visual areas, than our ASD subjects when reconstructing past experiences. So these findings really not only help to explain the nature of episodic memory differences in ASD behaviorally, but really add to evidence that suggests that these hippocampal cortical connections are what are really important for facilitating the explicit experience of episodic recollection. So to summarize, what we show here is that episodic memory in ASD is associated with a reduction in the number of event-specific details that can be recalled, but not in the precision of individual memory details. And this maps on to reduced hippocampal cortical functional communication during episodic memory retrieval very specifically. So with these results in mind, I actually just wanted to start to wrap things up by sharing this quote from a paper written by Jill Boucher in 2007 alongside an autistic individual, JS, about his experience, his personal experience with episodic memory. So JS visits the UK quite regularly, arriving at Heathrow. However, when he sets out on his journey, he cannot recall Heathrow or any details of how to travel from Heathrow to his destination. He has no memory of previous visits until he has arrived and recognizes something that then cues a memory. Of course, some degree of state dependency is a common factor for everyone. However, for JS, it can be close to total. To remember events, such as the activities of a trip abroad, JS formulates an account verbally reconstructed from a series of facts. And the order of these activities is also reconstructed by analytic reasoning. So what you can tell from this is that JS really cannot spontaneously recollect a previous episodic experience that he's had, at least mentally, until his external environment provides a lot of support for rebuilding that information. So what are some implications of these findings and the way JS experiences his memories? Well, first, we would argue that it really shows a reduced flexibility of what we call neurocognitive process-specific alliances. So this is reorganization of brain regions to act together to facilitate a specific type of cognitive process. So here, during episodic retrieval, we believe that the hippocampus and cortical regions are not reorganizing and connecting as efficiently that would enable that mental free reconstruction of a past event. And this could easily explain why memory in ASD is thought to be overly context dependent. And some nice research by Katie Morass has shown this in the context of eyewitness testimony, where if you give autistic participants a very common strategy that we use in neurotypical individuals, asking them to mentally reinstate the context of a previous event to facilitate remembering details, that actually really doesn't help them at all. And what does help is placing them back in the original physical environment in which that event took place. This could also generalize, of course, to our ability to form schemas and to extract information from previous episodic experiences to learn how we should adapt our behavior to new situations, something that autistic individuals often struggle with as well. And finally, of course, this difficulty in mentally reconstructing events should by no means be restricted to past experiences, and research within autistic children and adults has demonstrated that imagination, as well as also future thinking and prospection, is reduced in these individuals compared to in neurotypical controls. And actually something that I really am excited to see with the literature going forward is how this difficulty in mentally reconstructing and forming mental models of events might relate to these other cognitive and behavioral characteristics that we most associate with autism. So I just want to thank, first and foremost, the participants who take part in this research. They give up a huge amount of their time to help with these studies, and I'm extremely grateful for that. To my PhD supervisor, John Simons, and the rest of the memory lab, as well as collaborators that I've spoken to about lots of these ideas. And even though I haven't spoken about any of my postdoctoral work today, my current lab at Boston College, which is led by Maureen Ritchie, and all of the support that she's given me. And thank you to you for your attention.